stakeholder work group around performance-based regulation. I'll go forward to our agenda for today. Main component of our program today is the Rocky Mountain Institute are going to give us a presentation on other states' experiences in evaluating and implementing performance-based regulation. Then following that, given our new timeline that we have till May 9th to complete these discussions, we're going to revisit that discussion of what we want to get out of this stakeholder process. So we won't go through introductions, but again, this is everybody who's currently participating in the group, and would just ask as we go through the meeting, if you offer to speak, please just give your name and your organization so we know who's talking. But with that, I will turn it right over to the Rocky Mountain Institute. We have Kara Goldenberg and Janelle Wilson. I'll stop sharing and let you share your screen and take it from here.
Thank you, Larry. Okay, so can folks see my PowerPoint screen in full
We can,
view?
thanks.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you for that introduction, Larry, and it's nice to be with you all in Virginia. My name is Janelle Wilson, and I'll introduce myself more fully in just a moment. As Larry mentioned, we've been invited to join the conversation today to share with you some examples and case studies of lessons learned and experiences with performance-based regulation in other states. So we hope this conversation is going to be helpful and fruitful to the investigatory process that y'all are undertaking in Virginia. But first, maybe just a quick introduction to RMI. This is RMI's portfolio of work. We are an independent, nonpartisan global nonprofit of 800 experts working to support the energy transition in key geographies around the world. And RMI has a long history of working with states.
Sorry.
You want anything? Sorry. It sounds like there's. Okay. Seems like someone just wasn't on mute. As I was saying, RMI is an organization of experts working on the energy transition across the world. And we have a long history of working with state legislators, state agencies, regulators, utilities, municipalities, and other stakeholders. And Kara and I today are situated within the team that's focused on the electricity sector, where we focus on supporting states in the United States with navigating the important challenges and opportunities accompanying an increasingly electrified economy. So my name is Janelle Wilson. I am a manager on the electricity team. I've been with RMI for 4 years now, and in that time I have worked with a variety of states, including Hawaii and Washington, North Carolina, and a few others as they have explored or embarked on their journey to performance-based regulation. I'll turn it over to Kara to introduce herself.
Hello all, Kara Goldenberg. I am a principal on RMI's carbon-free electricity team, and I lead RMI's work on utility business model and regulatory reform. I've been working on PBR for several years now, and similar to Janelle, have worked directly in a number of states, and I'm looking forward to joining the conversation today.
Thank you, Kara. So I wanted to start this presentation with a preview of what we're going to be going through. When Kara and I were invited to join you all for this session today by the Virginia Department of Energy, we were asked to focus on other jurisdictions' experiences with implementing PBR, both comprehensive and incremental, which are terms that we'll describe in just a moment if they're new or unfamiliar. And also to describe some of the processes and journeys that have led to adoption of performance-based regulation in other jurisdictions. And so in service of those objectives, we have planned an agenda today where we'll cover first, what is incremental and comprehensive PBR? What's the difference? What are the hallmarks? What are things to look for? Then we'll transition into 2 deep dive case studies, looking at 2 very different states that have adopted comprehensive, or what we would say is nearly comprehensive, performance-based regulatory frameworks. We'll pause for question and answers then before proceeding into 3 additional case studies of states that have adopted PBR more incrementally. And these will be lighter touch case studies, but after which we'll pause again for Q&A. We'll share some takeaways with you from RMI's perspective, reflecting on these case studies in other states in which we've had experience or exposure. And then we'll have a broader discussion, open-ended, to reflect on what you're taking away from this conversation and what you'd like to bring into the process as you continue it in Virginia. So given that we have 3 Q&A breaks planned, the third will follow after we touch on incremental versus comprehensive. It's not showing right now on the screen, but I'll ask that folks use the chat feature to log any questions that are coming up for you in between those Q&A breaks. And we can either try to address them immediately within the chat, or we can save them to address them verbally when we get to those Q&A pauses. And we definitely encourage your participation, your active and vocal participation today. So if we get to a Q&A and you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, come off mute. We'd love to meet you and to hear your questions and try to address them. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kara to kick us off.
Excellent. Thanks, Janelle. So I know this is the 3rd meeting in the series, so you all have been discussing PBR and thinking about how it might be applied in Virginia for some months now. But in case there are new participants, we just wanted to give a brief definition of what we mean by performance-based regulation. So performance-based regulation, or PBR, is a regulatory approach that seeks to better align utilities' financial incentives with the interests of customers and society. PBR has been around for a long time. It was first implemented in the 80s. But lately, many states have been exploring the application of PBR, given the sort of growing divergence between the traditional cost of service model and new modern policy goals. So, similar to what Virginia has undertaken through this process. And we like to also note that PBR is not just one thing. It's not, a lot of people tend to think it means just performance incentive mechanisms, right? Tying a financial incentive to a particular outcome. But it's actually a collection of tools that can be used in many different ways. And because of that, next slide, Janelle. And because of that sort of wide application or different types of mechanisms that might be applied in different states, we think it's helpful to distinguish between incremental versus comprehensive PBR. And although we're presenting 2 options, most states are somewhere in the spectrum between incremental and comprehensive, but we have found it a helpful framework. So incremental PBR refers to layering on, Janelle, can you please move it back to this slide, the last slide. So incremental PBR is an approach that involves layering select PBR mechanisms onto a traditional cost of service model. So this might look like a mostly cost of service model with a few additional performance incentive mechanisms implemented. Perhaps it's a performance incentive mechanism for reliability or energy efficiency. Comprehensive PBR involves actually fundamentally restructuring the framework that utilities are operating within to improve the incentives it creates. And so next slide. Just a second here.
apologies. It seems like my internet is being slow to transition. I'm seeing the incremental PBR offers benefits, but comprehensive PBR is the more robust reform option. Is that not showing up yet?
It just did. Thanks, Janelle.
Okay. There'll be a delay then, I guess.
Okay. So incremental PBR, so to further define that, right, it involves actually creating new incentives to counteract the perverse incentives that cost of service regulation creates. These perverse incentives include the throughput incentive, where utilities have an incentive to increase sales, to increase their revenues. Other perverse incentives include CapEx bias and gold plating, which results in perhaps unnecessary capital investments. So incremental PBR, the attempt is to introduce new incentives that counter those perverse incentives. Comprehensive PBR, on the other hand, creates those new incentives, but it also attempts to actually remove the perverse incentives themselves. So comprehensive PBR tries to more fundamentally change the inherent motivation that utilities have. And it does that by trying to really target the specific areas that PBR can benefit. And so incremental PBR, while it's simpler, it also takes less time to develop, right? For a state that just might be starting out on PBR, it could be a helpful approach to sort of test the waters, get comfortable with implementing a sort of new regulatory approach. Comprehensive PBR, of course, by its nature, is more complex and therefore takes a longer time to develop. Many states who have, in our view, sort of achieved comprehensive PBR have had iterative processes where they've had PBR throughout a number of years, where they've been able to evaluate and refine mechanisms over time, as well as introduce new mechanisms to meet emerging needs. So that's to say, right, incremental PBR does not actually preclude the adoption of comprehensive PBR, but perhaps can be a stepping stone, if that makes sense for a state. Next slide. So what does comprehensive PBR actually mean, right? What do we mean by actually fundamentally changing utility incentives? So we've created a 4-pillar model that tries to explain sort of what are the objectives comprehensive PBR is set to achieve or attempts to achieve. So the 4 pillars are included here. They include incentivizing cost efficiency, right? Thinking about how to encourage utilities to explore what more cost-effective solutions might be available, to think about how they're operating their grids most efficiently. To remove the throughput incentive, right? So that incentive to increase sales. The third is to incentivize targeted outcomes. So really thinking about the priorities and the needs in a particular state and how to encourage utilities to focus and to bring their attention to those particular outcomes. And lastly, to equalize CapEx and OpEx incentives. And so this is really tied to addressing that CapEx bias and thinking about the opportunities to create a level playing field between CapEx and OpEx solutions. Next slide. So the different PBR tools that a state might use to achieve these different pillars are included on this slide. These are just examples. There could be others, but just to give you some better detail in terms of, okay, but what does that actually look like in practice? What does that mean in terms of the specific regulatory mechanisms that need to be put in place? And so in order to incentivize cost efficiency, when they're well designed, multi-year rate plans could support that. There are various tools within multi-year rate plans. I know you've been talking about them that can focus on cost efficiency. Shared savings mechanisms, which are a particular type of performance incentive mechanism that encourages utilities to invest in lower cost solutions, fuel cost sharing mechanisms, which share the risk of fuel cost variations between customers and the utility instead of the customers needing to bear all that risk. And then as well as metrics and scorecards. So thinking of how to make transparent cost trends so that regulators and other stakeholders have a better understanding of where utilities are spending money and how that spending is changing year to year. The second pillar, revenue decoupling, is usually the mechanism that is implemented to remove the throughput incentive. So pretty straightforward. Decoupling has been adopted in several states. I know that for electric utilities as well as gas utilities. So there is a lot of experience with that. For the third pillar, to equalize CapEx and OpEx incentives, there's sort of a range of strategies that try to equalize those incentives. They can be more narrow in nature and focused on, for example, particular categories of OpEx expenditures, like capitalizing energy efficiency expenses, or they can be broader in nature and try to really fully get at that CapEx bias. And then the last pillar is to incentivize targeted outcomes. And the tools that we find are most appropriate for that are performance metrics and scorecards and performance incentive mechanisms, where you can design those very specifically to measure and to incentivize particular outcomes like energy efficiency savings, or perhaps DER interconnection timeliness, right? There's a range of issues that you could focus on, and we'll have some examples in this presentation. Next slide. So we also wanted to talk about the process, right? Okay, how does one state get from initiating a PBR exploration to the end goal of potentially actually adopting a PBR framework for a state? And so we've seen a similar process be used in a number of states, where a state will, initiate a process, conduct a stakeholder process similar to the one that you all are participating in now. A report or recommendation will then result from that process. And then based on that, new rules or guidance will be established. Actual implementation will take place over time, and then potentially comprehensive reform would be achieved. And we've seen a number of states sort of navigate this process in different ways. And we've seen states sort of stop their processes at different milestones. And so we just wanted to sort of illustrate where different states have gone, how they've approached this, as you can see illustrated here. So back in 2020, Maine initiated a reform effort. It didn't really go anywhere. I do believe that Maine is restarting or perhaps reinitiating a process, but that just sort of fell flat, I would say. Nothing much came from it. Connecticut, you guys heard about Connecticut from Tom Wheel, I know, in the first workshop, but Connecticut is in the throes of their stakeholder process, really thinking about comprehensive PBR and a full suite of PBR tools. The stakeholder process has been multiple years, but we are getting nearer and nearer to the end. Colorado, we'll talk about Colorado in a minute, but they initiated an investigation and issued a report due to the direction of the legislation. And then the commission didn't do much with that report. So it's sort of, that process sort of stopped right there. And then Hawaii, which we'll also be talking about in just a second, is an example of a state that really achieved sort of all of the different steps in the process and are currently implementing a multi-year rate plan with several performance incentive mechanisms and other regulatory tools. And so we'll be able to take a look at how that has been going. And so this is just to highlight, right, while an initial exploration of PBR can be useful and it's been used in several processes, it's important to really think about the end goals of processes and what you want to achieve to ensure that those investigatory processes result in change if that is what is determined. Next slide. So don't let that illustration fool you. It's not as simple, right? PBR processes and to develop, what we would say well-designed PBR, the processes can be long and complex, right? There's no one-size-fits-all PBR model. You can't just look at another state and make a carbon copy of that and implement it in another jurisdiction. PBR really should be designed to meet the needs and priorities of a particular jurisdiction. And that process to figure out what is needed is an important step in the process. It's also important to think about how PBR intersects with other policies and regulatory processes, right? When thinking about creating new utility incentives, it's important to think about what else exists, how that might interact with different policies or regulatory directives. It's important to think about unintended consequences, right? Not all PBR has worked according to plan, right? We will be frank and transparent about that. Are risks involved. And so really thinking about how different PBR tools can interact with each other, as well as the other incentives inherent in a utility regulatory framework is really important. And lastly here, just thinking about the utility's role in the PBR process, they could come and show up to perhaps discussions resistant to change, right? PBR is a different way of doing things than they are used to, right? And so just being mindful of how the processes are designed so that all stakeholders can provide their perspectives and their input, which is important. Okay, next slide. So we will pause here for just a second before we get into the case studies to see if there's any questions. I see Kim.
Afternoon. Let me take my hand down now. Just a question. You identified those 4 types of kind of proceedings, items that you could do, whether it's a multi-year PBR or taking away the incentive of CapEx for O&M. Could you identify like the best ones that are out there in the country and kind of point us to those as an example to look at? I saw you had Hawaii listed as kind of good in general, but is there any one in particular in each of the categories that you could kind of point us to look at?
Yeah, I mean, I think for multi-year rate plans, there's several examples, and there's examples outside of the US as well. I saw that there was a presentation in the last workshop that showed how Alberta perhaps has been structuring their multi-year rate plans, which is interesting. As you say, I think Hawaii has a very solid multi-year rate plan framework that's been effective, as we'll show you some of the results, given there's an evaluation currently taking place. Minnesota and New York, they also have multi-year rate plans. I would say perhaps more mixed results in terms of their effectiveness as well as in Massachusetts. But I think there's definitely lessons learned and insights to glean from how those multi-year rate plans have been structured. For CapEx, OpEx equalization, I would say mostly what we have seen states have been adopting sort of very narrowly targeted mechanisms. So, for example, Maryland and Illinois have adopted an approach to, I'm sorry, Maryland and New Jersey have adopted an approach to capitalize their energy efficiency incentives. New York has adopted shared savings mechanisms for non-wires alternatives, and there's been a few other Northeast states to adopt those as well. So definitely, good examples to look at in terms of the more comprehensive CapEx, OpEx equalization strategies. The example to point to is the UK, which has adopted TOTEX rate making. There has not been an attempt to adopt a more comprehensive mechanism in the US, although there has been conversations in Connecticut that could be a potential opportunity in the future. Janelle, I might turn it to you in terms of performance incentive mechanisms, if there are any states that we might want to highlight there.
Yeah, that's a good question, Kira. Kim, I would, there's a resource that RMI has made available, which is called the Performance Incentive Mechanism Database, PIMS database. And that is a really helpful resource and tabulation of all of the PIMs that we are aware of that have been enacted or in place in the United States, specifically for mechanisms that are focused on more emergent outcomes, which you can see how we're defining emergent outcomes on the Performance Incentive Mechanism database. I'm not going to point to any one particular jurisdiction or state because I think there's a lot of really robust activity. 15 states have implemented PIMs for emergent outcomes. And there's really exciting inspiration to be found all across the country from the examples in the database. So I'll just stop with pointing you to that resource, and I'm happy to share a link in chat when we get to the end of the presentation.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, and Kim,
go ahead.
I was just going to say for that fourth pillar, removing the throughput incentive, I see Mark LaBelle's on RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project, has published a number of comprehensive resources that look at decoupling in different states. So I can maybe ask him to drop a link to that. And there are some really good, I think, lessons learned in those reports.
That sounds good. Can I just ask one follow-up, and then, because I'm sorry, I asked too many questions, but the multi-year rate plans, what is the typical length? I mean, we have biennial reviews in Virginia, and 2 years seems to be very good for a variety of reasons. But are there multiple ones, and what issues have they found if they're more like 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, so they are typically 3 to 5 years. So I think that has sort of been the sweet spot. There's been some jurisdictions that have attempted to make the multi-year rate plan longer, and that was too long. So I'd say 3 to 5 years has been what we've seen be most common. Hawaii's multi-year rate plan is 5 years. The proposal right now in Connecticut, it's not yet decided, but is 4 years. So somewhere in between that 3 to 5 years. And I think that level of detail, right, would be important to discuss as a group when you get clearer on how the multi-year rate plan is structured, whether or not it's based on cost forecasts, which can get more difficult to predict if the multi-year rate plan is longer, right? Or if revenue adjustments are based on external indices like inflation and productivity factors.
Do any of them have any kind of backwards look to see during that period how they're performing and their adjustments? Because 3 to 5 years we have found in Virginia gets to be too far because people, accounting systems, information gets harder to acquire when you're looking back when you go more than about 2 years. So that's why I'm asking this question.
Yeah. So there's several safeguards that can be implemented along with a multi-year rate plan that can account for if things go sort of awry, right? If utility earnings drop or if they are higher than expected, if, a mechanism is not functioning as intended, there are things that we call off-ramps or reopeners that would enable a commission to basically reevaluate the framework and see what mechanisms might require adjustments. There's also mechanisms called earning sharing mechanisms that also act as a safeguard to prevent under or over earnings. I think in terms of those are mechanisms I'd say that are available, Kim, within the multi-year rate plan. I think also we recommend that states think about how to adopt performance incentive mechanism review processes, right? And that could happen more regularly depending on the duration of the performance incentive mechanism, but to be able to evaluate how those are working and make any adjustments if necessary. After a multi-year rate plan, or perhaps near the end of a multi-year rate plan, we have seen states take a more comprehensive evaluation that is currently going on in Hawaii, where they are looking at the spending trends of the utility over the multi-year rate plan. What has been the results? What has been the impact of rates? What mechanisms have been working well, which have not, which I think is sort of best practice. Robert?
For the sake of time, Kara, I actually think it would be helpful for us to go ahead and dive into the case studies. I think we'll answer a lot of questions through the course of those case studies, and then we'll have future Q&A sessions. So Robert, acknowledging that your hand was raised, if you can type your question into chat or we can answer it in one of our subsequent Q&A sessions, please do so. All right. So with that, I'm going to share my screen once again, and we can continue on.
Okay, great. So we're going to start off with providing two examples of states that have set out to achieve comprehensive PBR. Next slide. So the first example we'll go through is Hawaii, which I have mentioned has a number of PBR mechanisms in place. Hawaii's PBR journey, though, started a long time ago. They've had many different iterations of PBR mechanisms. The PUC first adopted decoupling and a triennial rate case cycle or a multi-year rate plan back in 2010. There was a multi-year rate plan in place for a while. It was not necessarily working as they would have liked in terms of incentivizing utility cost containment, which is a primary objective in Hawaii, given their high electricity prices. So in 2018, the legislature actually passed the Ratepayer Protection Act, which directed the PUC to think about ways to improve the PBR framework and to more holistically change the incentives that the utilities are facing. That same month, the PUC initiated a proceeding to explore how to move to more comprehensive PBR. The process included a very extensive collaborative stakeholder process where a number of stakeholders came together to learn together what was possible. They evaluated the current mechanisms to understand what was going wrong and to think about what additional PBR mechanisms might be most important for achieving Hawaii's objectives. In 2020, the PUC adopted that new framework, and then there have been working groups since that date who have continued to finalize and iterate on the PBR mechanisms that were adopted, as well as propose and discuss new performance incentive mechanisms as well to address emerging needs. So the Hawaii process was bifurcated into two phases. The first phase established guiding principles, 12 regulatory outcomes, and 3 goals for performance-based regulation, as well as identified what PBR mechanisms would be further examined in phase 2. And then phase 2, stakeholders had the opportunity to actually dig into the details, do the analysis, and design, right? Finalize the design of a number of PBR proposals. Next slide. So as I said, that first phase, there was a number of goals, outcomes, and principles that were adopted. Given where you all are in your process, we thought it could be helpful to share a little bit more detail of what those were. So first and foremost, the PUC established 3 guiding principles that were repeatedly referred back to as the PBR framework was developed. First, the PBR framework was to take a customer-centric approach, right? Where customers were the focus of much of the mechanism design and thinking about how customers can benefit from this new framework. Specifically, this also included a sort of commitment to delivering immediate day one savings. And that then fed directly into the design of the multi-year rate plan to deliver those savings to customers. The second principle was administrative efficiency, and this was to reduce regulatory burdens for the utilities, for stakeholders, right, for the regulators themselves. So thinking about that 5-year gap, right, between rate cases or resetting rates. And then utility financial integrity, right? Hawaii recognized that what they were doing was bold and that they were making a big change to their regulatory framework. But they wanted to ensure stakeholders that maintaining the utility's financial health was a priority and that wasn't going to threaten that. So here are the then 3 goals and outcomes to that were used as a guiding post for the stakeholder process, and we were used to inform, for example, what performance mechanisms were adopted. You can see that they range from more traditional utility outcomes like affordability and reliability to more emergent outcomes like interconnection experience, DER asset effectiveness, electrification of transportation. Next slide. So here are some details on Hawaii's framework. This is relatively high level, so happy to answer further questions, or if you guys have more questions and want to follow up with Janelle or myself, happy to further explain. But as I said before, Hawaii adopted a 5-year multi-year rate plan. The rates that sort of were used going into the multi-year rate plan, so that the first year rates were based on previous rate cases. Hawaii has 3 investor-owned utilities, and so they all had separate rate cases. The revenue adjustment mechanism, so how Hawaii then adjusted those revenues throughout the multi-year rate plans, they used this formula that you see here. So it wasn't based on cost forecasts like some states use, but this formula is responsible for adjusting those rates between the years of the plan. So the formula included these factors: inflation, an X factor, which represents utility productivity, a Z factor that provides recovery for exogenous events, and a 2-part customer dividend. And the customer dividend was quite interesting. It was used in 2 different ways there. It was used as a stretch factor, which is common in multi-year rate plans. So basically it was, thinking about how much more efficient the utility could be given that they are operating under this different framework. And then it also was used to deliver savings that were identified in a management audit that took place in one of the rate cases for the biggest utility, HECO. And so that audit identified a lot of operational inefficiencies, other issues that were sort of emerging in how the utility was running their business. And so the PUC decided to use the customer dividend as a means to think about how to return some of those savings, given that the utility was going to be implementing the changes that the audit recommended. And then, as I said, importantly, there was a fourth year rate review that was implemented, which is currently ongoing. Hawaii had adopted full revenue decoupling, and it continues to. And they also adopted a earnings sharing mechanism to provide as a safeguard to prevent from over-earning and under-earning. Importantly, the earnings sharing mechanism had a very wide deadband where no sharing would take place. And that was the intention behind that, was to preserve the incentive, the cost efficiency incentive inherent in the multi-year rate plan, where if the utility can reduce their costs below the level of revenues that they are authorized, they can increase their earnings. And so that 300 basis points on the upper side sort of gives them the flexibility. And then there, as you can see, there was tiered sharing in place beyond that deadband. Next slide. So some additional mechanisms here. There was a large portfolio of performance incentive mechanisms, metrics, and scorecards that were adopted. Specifically, there were PIMs for DER interconnection timeliness, DER grid services, RPS achievement, AMI utilization, others. There are several, and then there have been new ones adopted since the framework went into effect. There was also a pretty novel shared savings mechanism that was implemented to provide a cost efficiency incentive for those costs that were beyond the costs that are recovered through that annual revenue adjustment. So these were costs that are recovered via cost trackers. So similar in Virginia, right? Hawaii has some specific cost trackers that include recovering fuel costs, purchase power costs, as well as some other specific capital investments. So in addition, there was an incremental capital funding mechanism authorized called the Extraordinary Projects Recovery Mechanism. This was to provide a recovery for large, lumpy projects that needed to be invested in during the multi-year rate plan period and don't really fall well under the annual revenue adjustment, in terms of that really covers sort of the day-to-day costs. And so the incremental capital funding mechanism relies on an application process. So the PUC has the ability to determine whether or not an investment should be authorized cost recovery. It's not just a sort of straight cost tracker. As I mentioned before, many states have adopted reopeners or off-ramps. So Hawaii also adopted one of those, which was really important in really providing insurance that, you know, if the PBR framework went off track, there was an opportunity to evaluate what was going wrong and make changes accordingly. And there was also a innovation pilot process that was adopted to increase or accelerate innovation during the multi-year rate plan period. Next slide. So as I said, there's a evaluation underway right now, looking at how the utility has performed throughout the multi-year rate plan, or at least throughout the first 3 years. We also wanted to note that when Hawaii adopted their PBR framework, they actually got a credit upgrade, which was a really important indicator that the financial community was not, you know, scared, I would say, of this big change, but they actually saw it as a positive development in terms of supporting utility revenues, sort of their predictability, right? Of course, as you all know, Hawaii had experienced a devastating fire on the island of Maui, which then has led to some financial distress for the utility. And so unfortunately, that credit rating has been downgraded, but that was, not due to the PBR framework. And so we also wanted to just show, there's been some analysis done on the HECO, the largest investor-owned utilities financials during the multi-year rate plan. So we've seen that there were limited shifts in O&M costs during the first 3 years of that multi-year rate plan. However, in real terms, the rate base has actually declined. And the utility has actually reduced their capital expenditures compared to what was being expended before the multi-year rate plan is in place, all while having the actual return on equity stay, in relative bounds in terms of what was authorized. So, there's going to be more discussions and more evaluation done. This was using, I would just want to be transparent, FERC 1 data, right? So I think we'll learn more in the coming months, but it is an indication that the cost efficiency incentive embedded in the multi-year rate plan potentially was effective in terms of lowering that CapEx. And we'll see what happens with further discussions. So, in thinking about those 4 pillars real quickly, that we just went through, right? Hawaii has a number of mechanisms in place to incentivize cost efficiency. We just went through all of them, but really thinking about where are the opportunities in the framework to support cost efficiency. They've had decoupling for a long time now. They've adopted some mechanisms focused on equalizing CapEx and OpEx incentives, although I would say that I do think this is an area that more could be done in as they perhaps think about what adjustments they want to make or new mechanisms to put in place for the next multi-year rate plan. And then, as I've said, a large portfolio of incentives focused on targeted outcomes that are important in the state. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Janelle, who's going to share a different story down in North Carolina.
Thank you, Karen. So in North Carolina, the PBR process is a little bit more recent, and experience with PBR is much more recent than in Hawaii, certainly. I'd say the start of the PBR process in North Carolina really kicked off in 2018 with an executive order, which spurred the state to develop a clean energy plan. And that plan culminated in a set of recommendations for further action, one of which was to launch a process with stakeholders to assess the energy regulatory landscape and how well it was delivering against 21st century public policy goals, customer expectations, utility needs, and technology innovation. The study process was referred to as the North Carolina Energy Reform Process, or NERP, and that was a year-long stakeholder process which examined adoption of PBR, enabling securitization for retirement of fossil assets, studying opportunities to increase competition in the electricity system, and then implementing competitive procurement processes for investor-owned utilities. There were a set of, similar to Hawaii, a set of guiding outcomes that stakeholders identified for the NERC process, which I provided here on the right side of the screen. They had a long list, and I know the enabling legislation or the statute that catalyzed this Virginia PBR investigation process had a long list of outcomes. And one of the key things I think that enabled the stakeholder success was aligning on and prioritizing a few of those outcomes to really focus on as they were evaluating what were the recommendations that were the right fit for North Carolina. After the conclusion of the NERT process, there were a variety of recommendations, and you can see the link to the final report from that process at the bottom of the slide, which I'm happy to share with everyone after this presentation. But subsequent to that, it went into the legislative process or space. And eventually a law was passed, H951 in North Carolina, which set into statute very specific guidance for how PBR should look in North Carolina. And then subsequent to that in 2023, the first PBR applications were approved by the North Carolina Utilities Commission. And I can talk about those in just a second. So very early stages of the performance-based regulatory implementation stage. So a little bit about the North Carolina framework. As I said, most of the PBR framework is enshrined in statute in North Carolina, which I will flag that in reality means that regulators have limited ability to modify or adjust the framework if it turns out to have perverse outcomes, or if it turns out that it's getting off track. So there's less room for modification that I just wanted to flag with that approach. In terms of the multi-year rate plan, their 3-year duration, the way that rates are set is that they use a historical test year, and then they add a set of discrete and identifiable capital spending projects to be placed in service during the first rate year. And then successive rate years are also incremental capital investment are added to the first year and second year years of the rate plan. There is a limitation on the annual increases that can happen between years of the rate plan. For the second and third rate years, the increase in revenues required cannot exceed 4% of the prior year. But notably, I'll just flag that this does not apply to the first year of the rate case, of the multi-year rate plan, excuse me. And then I would say I wanted to flag too that any revenue that's over 500 million, or any capital generation plant project that will be needed during the term of the multi-year rate plan that is in excess of $500 million is not included in the multi-year rate plan. Instead, that can get regulatory asset treatment in a separate process, and then recovery can be considered in a separate proceeding. The earnings sharing mechanism in North Carolina is such that there is a narrow band around the authorized ROE of 50 basis points plus or minus. And if the utilities ROE exceeds that 50 basis point threshold in the upwards direction, 100% of excess revenues are returned to customers. But there is no sharing of any deficits on the downside. Revenue decoupling in North Carolina is applicable just to the residential ratepayer class, and it excludes estimated EV charging sales. For the commercial and industrial ratepayer classes, a net loss revenue adjustment mechanism is still applied. Continuing to elaborate on the PBR framework, PIMs are a part of the framework in North Carolina. It is an optional, if not a required element of the framework, but a constraint on the application of PIMs in North Carolina is such that the total value of all PIM incentives or penalties cannot exceed 1% of the first year of the multi-year rate plan's annual revenue requirement. And incentives that already existed for demand-side management and energy efficiency are not subject to that constraint. In terms of the stay-out provision or the safeguard, if the utility earns lower than the authorized ROE, they are allowed to initiate a new rate case during the course of the multi-year rate plan. So it's a very low barrier to coming back to file a rate case during the multi-year rate plan term. And then in terms of other tracked costs, Cost trackers remain. There was no effort, there's no requirement to merge or consolidate cost trackers into base rates as part of the multi-year rate plan. So there's still a lot of cost trackers that exist in addition to the multi-year rate plans. So this is what multi-year rate plans, the first multi-year rate plans for Duke Energy Carolinas in progress actually look like in North Carolina. The PIMs that were approved in the state are focused on reliability, integrating renewables, and increasing customer participation. There's also a variety of tracking metrics that I've listed on the slide and can point people to the Duke Energy webpage where the performance against these PIMs and these metrics are already being tracked. Just to point you to the table at the center of the slide here, I think this is where you see the annual revenue requirements for each rate year for each of the utilities. And here you can see where the 4% requirement or cap on rate year 2 and rate year 3 are honored and respected. But the first year rate case actually represents a much higher than that increase relative to prior rate cases before these multi-year rate plans were adopted. So just a quick assessment of the multi-year rate, the PBR framework in North Carolina. I'd say, in my perspective, the PBR statute creates an incentive to inflate cost via the design of the multi-year rate plan and via the use of forecasted capital costs, which creates an incentive for the utility to exaggerate their expected levels of capital and fixed operational expenses to secure a higher approved revenue requirement. And then I'd say that the combination of that with the very narrow earning sharing mechanism deadband mitigates the incentive to seek deep cost efficiencies for the utility that might otherwise would have existed had the earning sharing mechanism been a little bit more expansive. So I think it's definitely true that this framework will incentivize some level of cost efficiency. I do think it'll be modest, where deeper cost efficiencies might be unlikely to be pursued. We'll see how things turn out. In terms of removing the throughput incentive, the application of revenue decoupling mechanism just to the residential class, I think, is a little short of fully removing the throughput incentive, given that it still exists to some extent with the commercial and industrial classes, although it's partially addressed through the net loss revenue adjustment mechanism there. And then I'd say in terms of the carving out of sales for energy for electrified vehicles, I think there are different schools of thought here. The perspective I take on this issue is that this carve out creates a little bit of unnecessary complexity. Some other jurisdictions like Massachusetts have recently been evaluating and reassessing their revenue decoupling mechanism and whether it's still serving the interest of ratepayers. And in Massachusetts, they recently decided that its revenue decoupling is still really important to support energy efficiency and motivating the utility to pursue that earnestly. And that supporting electrification can be more meaningfully met through a performance incentive mechanism, for example. There are no elements of the PBR framework in North Carolina that are focused on CapEx and OpEx incentives and equalizing those incentives. However, I'd say that I think it's a possibility that in future PBR applications and rate cases, that could be an option for a PIM. And then finally, in terms of incentivizing targeted outcomes, I mentioned there are 3 performance incentive mechanisms. I think combined respectively, their total value is $8 million and $10 million per year, which is relatively low for a utility of the size of Duke Energy in North Carolina. So I'll pause there and open the floor for questions on these 2 case studies.
So this is John Lord with the Virginia Energy Purchasing and Governmental Association. I just want to thank you for answering the questions that I put into the chat earlier. And I am looking forward to, if you are willing to send that template link, I think probably some of the other stakeholders would love to see it too. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely, John.
Hi, Karen General. Thanks so much for this presentation. This is Kaja with the Virginia Energy Consumer Alliance. Given what you know about where Virginia is in this process, Virginia Energy has to produce a report to the State Corporation Commission, and then the State Corporation Commission will ultimately produce a final report to the General Assembly. And so I guess I wondered, from your perspective, where we're at in this process, what do you see as potential next steps, and what would be a helpful, what do you all see as the best way to maximize our time with the remainder of this stakeholder process, to also be helpful to give to our commissioners in the report that Virginia Energy produces?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kaja. I think there are a variety of, this is more of a subjective question, I'll acknowledge, and so I'll provide a subjective response. I think that in the study process and the ultimate final report that this group will be submitting to the SEC, I think it can be really helpful to be very clear and articulate to the questions that John was asking earlier. What are the problems with the existing regulatory framework in Virginia that actually need to be fixed? And by thinking about the problems that need to be fixed and doing a really thorough evaluation of the current incentive structure that utilities are facing, that can be a helpful step in identifying what are the right solutions for Virginia. And so I just double click on that, and I will say, yes, happy to share the resources from other jurisdictions in terms of how they've conducted that evaluation process. Kara, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, maybe I would just say that, prior to doing the regulatory assessment, it is also really important to identify the goals and the outcomes, right? So similar to that slide I presented, but really clarifying within the group of stakeholders that are very active in Virginia, what is it that you are wanting to achieve, right, with utility regulation? What is number one, right, or what is top of mind in terms of the challenges I know the state is going to be facing in upcoming years, right? And that then hopefully will provide a guide in terms of thinking about what mechanisms could be the most effective.
This is Rob Luck from Dominion Energy. Thanks for the excellent information. It's great to look at other states, what they're doing, and how they're getting to these ends. In the state of Virginia, we have performance-based mechanisms. We adjust ROE based on generation plant performance, customer service, operating efficiency based on commission-established criteria, which has scorecard metrics and additional metrics, and there's refunds of base generation and distribution revenues to customers if that ROE is exceeded, and over time it's an increasing share. It has been an increasing share for customers. So have you sort of taken a look at Virginia as you're doing these case studies and sort of mapped us against others?
Yeah, that's a great question, Robert. Thank you. I would say I've been tracking the performance incentive mechanism process in Virginia relatively recently. I'm newer to the context and the regulatory space in which y'all are operating. So I'm very interested to learn more about the mechanisms that have been in place, how long they've been in place. In terms of conducting an evaluation or a comparison of where Virginia is relative to other jurisdictions, it's not something that I have done yet, but I would be interested to see what, if someone did that, what the findings were.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we have a few more case studies to get through. They're going to be shorter. because there are states that have incrementally adopted PBR. So I'm going to go ahead and move us there, and then we'll have another opportunity for Q&A and potentially discussion at the end. So with that, let me share my screen once more. Alrighty. So we'll be talking about Colorado, Minnesota, and Maryland, and look forward to answering more questions soon.
Okay, excellent. So Colorado has taken a pretty piecemeal approach to performance-based regulation over the years and have tried implementing different mechanisms at different points in time. So Xcel, the major investor-owned utility in Colorado, had operated under 3-year multi-year rate plans, both in 2012 to 2014 and then in 2015 to 2017, but then did not propose a multi-year rate plans after that. Colorado also had a revenue decoupling pilot, which was implemented from 2020 to 2023. Similar fate as the multi-year rate plans, the utility has decided not to propose decoupling in the latest rate case. So these things were piloted, mixed experiences in terms of how they went, and are no longer in place in Colorado. However, in 2019, the legislator directed the PUC to consider PBR reforms more holistically. In 2020, the PUC conducted a stakeholder process and investigated, what PBR mechanisms might be most appropriate for the state. They delivered a report to the legislator, but essentially recommended that the commission and utilities just continue focusing on performance incentive mechanisms specifically. And so there have been a number of performance incentive mechanisms implemented throughout the years. They've had PIMs for demand side management and reliability for a number of years. There's been more recently an equity PIM that was implemented as part of Xcel's transportation electrification plan. An interesting beneficial electrification PIM also implemented in recent years. And then lastly, last year, the PUC also adopted PIMs to really focus on incentivizing cost containment for utility-owned projects that are selected in Xcel's all-source procurement process, given some previous experiences where those costs have diverged significantly from what was approved. So yeah, a mixed bag here, but Colorado is really an example of a state that has tried different mechanisms, but performance incentive mechanisms have been where they have focused. I have heard whisperings that Colorado might be investigating more comprehensive PBR in the year to come. So we'll see if that comes true. Janelle? Janelle, it looks like you're on mute still.
Thank you. In Minnesota, the commission has the authority to approve multi-year rate plans, and Xcel has been operating under multi-year rate plans since 2015 in the state. The method of setting the revenue requirement as part of the multi-year rate plan is an approach looking at a historical test year and then incrementally projecting additional CapEx expenditures over the course of the rate plan. The commission notably does not require supplemental cost recovery tools such as cost trackers, riders, or deferred accounting mechanisms to be consolidated. However, they do note in their policy statement around the use of multi-year rate plans, that utilities shall be encouraged at every opportunity to consolidate those costs into the base rates of the multi-year rate plan where practicable. There is the use of interim rates in Minnesota frequently between when the moment when the utility applies for the multi-year rate plan and the moment when those approved rates are finally set into action. And there's a true-up mechanism that happens between interim rates and what is actually approved. And so in the most recent multi-year rate plan rate case, the interim rates were higher than what the commission ultimately approved, so customers were refunded. So it's an interesting approach there to highlight. And then I'll just highlight too, there was a settlement agreement in the 2017 multi-year rate plan case, which adjusted Xcel's annual revenue requirements down significantly from what the utility had proposed, such that the annual increases over the years of the multi-year rate plan were lower than inflation. And as part of that settlement agreement, there was also an element where Xcel agreed to not seek any new riders over the course of the multi-year rate plan, so no additional cost trackers. And they also agreed to a one-way capital spending true-up mechanism that would make refunds to ratepayers if Xcel spent less than it budgeted for capital expenditures. But they were not able to increase rates if they overspent on capital. And that true-up is based on aggregate capital spending rather than at a project-by-project level. The revenue decoupling mechanism, I won't dwell on that for too long, other than to say that it's something that was authorized in statutes in the early aughts. And then Xcel's first revenue decoupling mechanism in Minnesota took place between the 4-year period of 2017 to 2020. And annual upward rate adjustments that happened over the course of that revenue decoupling pilot were capped at 3% of revenues, with the remaining being recovered in subsequent years if their true up was in excess of that 3% cap. And then performance metrics, though Minnesota was initially ambitious in terms of setting the goal of developing performance incentive mechanisms, what they decided to do instead was to create a really robust portfolio of tracking metrics specifically against 6 outcomes. And what they are now, with the initial intent that at some point in time, once enough data had been collected, they would start to set targets and benchmarks for those metrics, some of which would eventually be turned into performance incentive mechanisms, which have a financial incentive tied to them for the utility. The commission has decided that they'll continue to collect a few more years of data, and you can find the docket number for finding those performance metrics and the utility's performance reports for the first few years. But it's uncertain whether, given the commission's most recent decision, whether they will eventually progress onto PIMS, and they've opened the question to stakeholders to evaluate whether that's still appropriate given where they are right now. Quickly moving on to Maryland, just because Maryland is a close neighbor to Virginia, and also operates within PJM, we thought it'd be helpful to talk about this. This is a state where performance-based regulation, specifically the use of multi-year rate plans, has been quite contentious for certain stakeholders. The first utility to implement a multi-year rate plan was BG&E, and that began in 2021. Other Exelon utilities operating in Maryland, Pepco and Delmarva, have subsequently enacted multi-year rate plans of their own. The multi-year rate plan process was a really abbreviated one, led by the commission, in which stakeholders had 4 months to think through the appropriate design of multi-year rate plans. And eventually what was approved was an approach that is based on forecasted project level data for the first year, and then program level data for second and third years, large capital expenditures over $1 million or 0.5% of the utility's annual capital budget. need to provide project level data in the multi-year rate plan application. There is another component or interesting wrinkle in Maryland where the multi-year rate plan has a reconciliation adjustment where overspending the approved revenues in one rate case can be recovered in future rate cases. The commission right now in Maryland is actively undergoing a lessons learned process, or conducting a lessons learned process rather. So it might be an interesting one to tune into to see what the commission discovers and determines with regard to the multi-year rate plan pilot process. This slide just really briefly shows the BG&E example with the first multi-year rate plan. With the plant additions that were proposed by BG&E in the second multi-year rate plan, distribution plant additions in 2025 and 2026 would have been almost triple what they were in 2017. And you can see here just the trend in BGE's electric distribution rates since its first multi-year rate plan went into effect in 2021. BG&E just anecdotally did overspend their operations and maintenance budget in the first multi-year rate plan by more than $100 million. But BG&E is not necessarily alone. So there are significant increasing costs that the other Exelon utility companies operating in Maryland are experiencing. And that's demonstrated in this table here, where you can see that BG&E, Delmarva, and Pepco are the three utilities with multi-year rate plans in operation. And you can see the typical change, the change in the typical customer bill per year between when the multi-year rate plan for that utility first went into effect and 2023. So really quickly, just wrapping up, I think with a few takeaways on PBR design and implementation from other state experiences. I think from RMI's perspective, a holistic reform strategy is really helpful. And that starts with clarity around outcomes and what your desired end state for adopting or undergoing a transformation of the regulatory framework is. Secondarily, assessing the existing regulatory framework can be a really helpful process to articulating the specific challenges in terms of the utility incentives that exist today. And that can be a really useful guide in determining what are the right tools within the toolkit that performance-based regulation offers that are going to be the right fit for the jurisdiction. We also encourage taking a portfolio approach, rather, thinking holistically about a variety of mechanisms and thinking about how building in intentional time in the plan or in the implementation phase to evaluate how things are going. And if things aren't going well, to build in time for that learning and adaptation process such that the PBR framework that you're endeavoring can be modified and tweaked as time progresses so that it fits the needs of the jurisdiction. I think, sort of speaking to some of the more recent case studies we touched on, it's really important that the multi-year rate plan be designed very thoughtfully with cost control front of mind. Multi-year rate plans, just because a multi-year rate plan exists or just because PBR exists does not mean it is good PBR, right? Just in the same way of thinking about, all forms of regulation. The detail, what matters is the detail, and the details of the design have tremendous impact on the actual outcomes from the mechanisms that are adopted. It's also really important to consider the interactive effects between different mechanisms and the different incentives that creates for the utility. And then, as I said earlier, just double clicking that building in time for evaluation, assessment, and modification to adjust the framework as part of the PBR journey can be really helpful in allowing a commission and allowing stakeholders and the utility to be agile to the demands and the needs that they're facing over the course of this journey. So I'll conclude by just showing on the screen that we have there's so many excellent resources available in the industry on performance-based regulation. and we're happy to make our slides available and point you to even more resources that aren't shown here or that we've discussed today. So I'm going to stop sharing and open the floor for questions. Kate, go ahead.
Hey, y'all. I really appreciate everything that you've been saying today, and these presentations have been really helpful. How do you recommend reaching clarity on outcomes and desired ends? I liked that point of your slide, but that it's a good concept. And how do you see other states doing a good job of facilitating that process?
I can take this, Janelle, if you'd like. Yeah. So how this has proceeded in other states, right, is a process that we like to say in RMI called diverge, emerge, and converge, right? There should be a process to sort of brainstorm and get out on the table what are all of the goals and outcomes different stakeholders are bringing to this process, right? What is the range that you all are working on? And then getting an opportunity for you all to respond to each other's goals and priorities. What is emerging, right, as particular priorities in this state? Is there consensus, right, that could be formed in terms of the most important goals and outcomes? And so we've seen this done successfully in Hawaii and Connecticut, Nevada, where it really has taken, a few meetings, not just one meeting, right, but a few meetings to have these conversations and to surface these ideas and to come to some agreement or alignment in terms of priorities going forward. And then in addition to those in-person meetings, I think soliciting written comments for reactions and further input between meetings can also be helpful.
Okay. Well, if there are no further questions from the group, we have considered 2 discussion questions that we'd like to ask you all. So I'm going to share my screen once more and just flash these questions up on your screen. So hopefully you can see these questions that we've been thinking about. We were invited here today to share with you some of the lessons learned and the different approaches other states have used. And I'm curious, what did this spark for you? What elements about the approaches used in these state examples would you like to see Virginia explore further or emulate in this study process? And then a secondary question you're also welcome to respond to is what questions are you holding about these case studies that would be informative for Virginia's PBR study process in terms of the next direction you might take or further investigation that might be required as y'all continue to evaluate what comes next in this process. So maybe take a minute if you have thoughts. Feel free to type them or journal them, type them into chat, or you can raise your hand and come off mute, and we'd love to hear from you. Sorry, John. It looks like you were ready to go.
Well, that's okay. I was just going to say, one of the things I really think we still, as a group, haven't yet fully decided on is what's missing. I think that a lot of the stakeholders have said already that we have elements of performance-based rates and performance-based regulation that have been built into Virginia's electrical regulation for quite a long time. We have some things that I think various stakeholders would like to see improved. I know that the legislation of the Virginia Clean Economy Act has got some issues that need yet to be addressed, but it's not like the things are being overlooked or missed. It's that the legislation had if it's not practical, if it's not feasible option. And so if something's not practical and it's not feasible, is it because of our cost of service rates? And we could potentially make it feasible with performance-based rates? I don't know. That's a good question that I think we should ask. But the template that you all have your troubleshooting guide. I'm not sure the right term for it, but how do you look at your existing systems and see, is there something going wrong? That's probably, in my opinion, our next best step that would be really valuable.
Thanks, John. Other thoughts?
This is Kaja. I would just echo John's thoughts. I do think that a potential part 2 of our current regulatory assessment would be helpful. We did have a couple of groups give presentations at the last meeting about some of the challenges that they saw and outcomes that they'd like to see prioritized. But just given the complexity of our current regulatory framework and the complexity of the potential tools that we could use to explore some of those challenges, I think a part 2 to that initial kind of current assessment would be helpful, where we talk a little bit more specifically about the Virginia-centered challenges, the outcomes we'd like to see done. And then moving forward, some more in-depth explorations of some of these tools. I think there could probably be meetings dedicated entirely to an exploration of multi-year rate plans and decoupling, and then a meeting probably dedicated to PIMs and scorecards and metrics. And so you all, as having worked in this field and other states, it might be helpful to, if you have recommendations for experts and folks that have lots of experience working on these issues, or if you yourself have recommendations, I think that might be helpful for us as a group moving forward.
Thanks, Kaja. I see another hand is raised. Kate, it looks like you're up next.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just want to echo that Kaja said basically word for word what I would have liked to say. I think she did a really good job of discussing what type of process would be really helpful in moving forward for Virginia's PBR process.
Thanks, Kate. Carmen?
Hi, Property Law Center. Agree with John and Kaja and Kate, who chimed in too. Yes, the next step definitely is for us to take a hard look at what the current process is in Virginia, so that we can determine really whether or not the process that we have, the PIMs that we have, are actually effective or not. I will push back hard to say that there are some PIMs that we have that have been on the books for a long time that have very little impact on the customer's rates, simply because they're not defined in a way that are already effective to have an impact on those rates. So yeah, we might have the PIM in there, but it doesn't do anything. And it certainly doesn't achieve what we see at Virginia Property Law Center as the impact we want it to have for the residential customers in Virginia. So it's something that we really have to look at. We have to be honest about, and then we really should have some deep discussions on whether or not we want to change how those PIMs are actually being used and how they're defined.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Carmen. Yeah, it sounds like there's some general alignment that, or one of the primary takeaways I hope landed for folks today from Kara and my presentation on these different case studies is that there's a lot of different variations of what performance-based regulation can look like in practice, and that variation has a significant influence over the outcomes that are realized and whether the desired outcomes are achieved and fulfilled. And so not all performance-based regulatory frameworks are created equal. And it's really important, I think, to your point, Carmen, to build in opportunities to assess, like, okay, we've been doing this element of performance-based regulation. Is it serving ratepayers? Is it serving the utility? Is it serving our societal objectives and our policy goals? Yeah, it sounds like that's a point that's been consistent in everyone I've heard volunteer so far. Recognizing Kara and I have taken all of the time we have been allotted, I want to just conclude by thanking you all for your attention and your engagement in this conversation. You have our email addresses here. We'll make our slides available to everyone. It was a great pleasure to join you for this conversation today, and we'll be hanging out for the rest of the call too. So happy to answer questions via chat or via our emails after this conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Karen, Janelle, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation, and thank you as well for being so responsive to everyone in the chat as well. We'll try and make sure that's recorded when we're putting all these materials up on the website. And you've teed us up very well for the remainder of this session, where we want to discuss next steps. So if you will give me just one moment, I'll share my screen. And as you know, when we met initially, we thought our timeline to finish this process was, I believe, February 7th. It has now been moved to May 9th. So does give us more room. Still a very compressed timeline for such a complicated subject, but definitely gives us more scope to meet and go a little more in depth. So given that, we wanted to talk a little more about this process, and these are kind of the four high-level areas we wanted to talk about. One is, what our output or what our goals should be for this group. To accomplish that, what sort of meeting content and meeting structure would we like to see? Thirdly, what's a reasonable timeline for accomplishing that, with meeting frequency, things like that. And then lastly, just what written comment opportunities should also be available alongside our meetings. So as a means to get that conversation started, we had sent out this sort of provisional timeline, but this is certainly not set in stone. We just thought it might be a little easier for people to think ahead if they had something to react to. And I think we've already heard that there seems to be some interest in revisiting the concept of reviewing our current structure. We did that in the last meeting. We had some really good presentations on perspectives, but it sounds like maybe we need to go deeper again. And as Karen and Janelle mentioned, there may even be some framework tools we can have participants fill out to help even formalize that review and get a different kind of output. But having said that, I'll just move through these questions. So beginning with what we want to accomplish. I think in our provisional meeting, we had discussed highlighting areas or key questions for the Commission's consideration as a sort of end goal. And I just wanted to check before moving on to possible other outputs, is that still a reasonable thing for inclusion in our final report, as it will be challenging to go fully in depth in everything we might wish to, but maybe there's going to be some areas where the best thing we can do is tee things up for the Commission to look into it further. I'll take silence as complete agreement. Catch that?
Yeah, sorry. I missed the second half of your question. Could you just restate that really quickly?
Yes, I just want to see if something we still would be interested, something we need to be recording as we go, are the key questions and considerations that we may not be able to get to as a group, that we may put forward in our final report and say to the Commission, these are the areas we still think you need to look more in depth to complete your final study.
Okay, wanted to make sure I understood that correctly. And yeah, I think that sounds great. And one thing that I thought might be helpful, and this maybe is jumping ahead, but thinking about the public comment period as a part of that, if there are things that we can't cover over the course of the meeting, if it'd be possible to kind of have an open comment period for stakeholders to respond to, a list of kind of guiding questions or areas to explore. That way, if stakeholders have thoughts on those things for the Commission to consider, it could be helpful for them to submit them in a written form if we can get them in those official meetings.
Yeah, yes, that's something we wanted to discuss as well. I think previously we had talked about having comment opportunities where participants could respond to the content of each meeting, digest what was said and then provide their own perspectives. I think we can still offer that. And we have heard interest from a few stakeholders about having a broader comment period. And maybe that is something we can keep open until, say, the middle of April, and that would give us time to collect all those comments and also include them in the final submission to the commission. Okay. Well, given that question has come up, does anyone have any other sort of thoughts on written comments, or does that seem reasonable? Okay, and I know all these parts are intertwined, so if you have thoughts later on as we're discussing other aspects, just let us know. So going back to this question of goals and output, what other outputs do we think are reasonable in the time frame? Just noting we are trying to build the record of our discussions here. We have the presentations, written comments as we go. We're recording these meetings, but what else do you think could be in that draft report? What's reasonable between now and May for this group to put together? Any thoughts on that? John?
So I think we've touched on this already, but since all we're going to be able to do in some cases is really just recommend further research, if we identify the things that we believe are problems or areas of opportunity under current regulatory framework, and we identify some mechanisms or some PIMs that have addressed those issues in other localities, that could be a potential good output. Here's the known, identified, agreed upon areas of issue, and here are some tools that we know have worked at other locations. That might be a good output.
Thanks, John. Any other thoughts on that question? I think one additional output we'd envisioned, if you look at our meetings 5 and 6 here, that the idea that maybe stakeholders would present their concepts for how different PBR mechanisms could be deployed in Virginia. We could have those presentations as well as have some written summary of the discussion that accompanies it. So really get a little more detail on the pros and cons, or the amendments that some would suggest, or the reasons why others may think it's not effective. So yes, Katja.
Yeah, I like that suggestion, and I wonder if, just given that some of these tools might be new concepts to most of the stakeholders here, I imagine it might be difficult for some of them to really propose kind of what these tools would actually look like, or how they've served solutions for the problem, since we're also still trying to wrap our head around what the current framework is. And so if there are opportunities to continue talking about the tools in further depth, but maybe have presentation from folks who have worked on these tools or who have more knowledge and can apply them to the Virginia context, including, if there are thoughts from folks at the State Corporation Commission, et cetera. I think that might be a helpful opportunity for folks to still continue to learn and offer their feedback about the tools, but not have to kind of come up with the solutions from scratch while they're still in the learning process.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. We're all at different levels when it comes to PBR, and we had considered, in what would currently be meeting for, really going in depth on some of the different PBR issues, things like multi-year plans. And then the presentations from stakeholders, I think, would be on a voluntary basis, from the stakeholders who are a little more comfortable to take that step to propose. But in giving everybody a chance to react, either at the time or in written comments afterwards, I would hope we'd be able to capture, everybody's perspective. Yep. So any other thoughts on that question of output or goals for the group? Okay. Well, the next two things are sort of get into meeting content, which we've delved into a little, and then timeline. So maybe the easiest way would just be to see if anyone has initial reactions to this proposed timeline we have. I think the one thing we heard distinctly as part of RMI's presentation is we maybe do want to revisit that question of reviewing the current regulatory structure so we can think how to fit that in. But otherwise, are there any initial reactions to this, both the content and the timing of what we've presented here? Or does it seem reasonable even if you just agree? Yes, Kit.
I just want to say thank you for putting so much thought into this. This is so much more than we expected at the beginning of this process. And so we've been really grateful that you guys have listened to that feedback and that you made this work to have a more robust process. So this is fantastic. I really liked some of the suggestions Kaja made earlier. And then the other piece I think would be interesting here is building out some ways to engage stakeholders that aren't already engaged in this process. I don't quite know what that would look like. I put a question in for Kara and Janelle, but I think you've got a really good group of folks engaged right now, but I think it would be really interesting to make sure that we are engaging the full breadth of stakeholders in this process. And I think there's a lot of the usual cast of characters that doesn't necessarily touch all of the people that are touched by PBR.
Yes, I'd agree with that. And, we have tried to capture as many people as we can, but we are entirely open to suggestion if you think because of somebody's expertise on the utility side or because PBR can touch so many different aspects. If there's anyone who could sort of talk about the impacts of, regulatory structures on those aspects, that would be great as well. So yeah, encourage everyone in the group, if you have suggestions of folks who you think would be good to add, please just let us know and we'll reach out to them. I see a question from Katja about the April meeting. I think that meeting we'd have some feedback in the draft and probably primarily wanting to make sure we'd captured things accurately, make sure that the discussions have been captured accurately. We're certainly not misrepresenting any stakeholders' perspective or statements that they have made. And equally, have we captured everything that we discussed that was important? So mostly, checking we haven't left any gaps, checking for accuracy, I would say is what I would envision currently for that April meeting.
Got it. Thanks so much.
All right, and then I go back to the question. Any other subjects that you think are important that wouldn't currently be captured with this timeline, and adding maybe another session or somehow incorporating that review of the current structure. Just Okay,
Hey,
so
Larry,
in general, sorry, go ahead, Robert.
Hey, Larry, sorry, yeah. So if I'm correct, there's an active docketed case that's out there getting, a lot of stakeholder input and staff evaluation on PBR right now. How do we pull that information into this process or just keep them separate? I'm struggling to see, what's the value of this versus that.
Yeah. Well, I won't speak to the value, but my understanding is they're to be kept separate, and I don't know if anyone from the commission wants to speak to that, but I believe we're treating them as two completely separate processes.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Does anyone from the commission have any more clarity on that?
Hi, Larry. This is Brian Pratt. I'm with the Virginia SCC. you essentially got that right. We do have two separate proceedings. They're a little bit different, directed by separate legislation, but they do both touch on PBR related topics. But they are, you're correct, they are separate proceedings. That's about probably the extent I could elaborate unless there's additional questions.
Thanks, Brian. All right. So just any other views on this timeline and content, you know, if it's reasonable or if there's anything else you'd like to see?
Larry, I just wanted to point out from the chat that there was suggestion for April meeting to maybe be in person.
Yes, thanks, Jonica. Yeah, that's another question we had, is if we still wanted to keep meetings virtual. So I'll put that out there first. There's some interest in person. Would the rest of the group be interested in moving in person at some point? I think that the suggestion here is maybe just for our last meeting, or is virtual still the preference? And we could always, we'll do some calendar polling after this, so we could always include the virtual versus in person in that. Yeah. And one thing we had, oh, thanks, John. I see virtually is generally better. And then Elizabeth, you had a comment?
Yeah, sorry, I don't have access to the chat, so I can't comment on the virtual versus the in-person, but I like the idea of being in person. I just know that sometimes it's not feasible, so maybe a hybrid meeting would be helpful. And also going back to your earlier question about anything that we see in the schedule that's maybe left off. This is maybe a little bit simplistic, but just going off of RMI's presentation, I don't really see us having a discussion about what outcomes we want to see, not from the process, but from PBR itself. So a discussion about shared goals, or even like a review of existing legislation and regulations where those goals are already embedded. Maybe I'm just not seeing something that's already there, but I think that would be a helpful discussion to have.
Yeah, does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd echo Elizabeth's points. I think that would be really helpful. I think one kind of common theme I'm hearing in this call is not really maybe understanding what we're hoping to get out of this process. And I do think goal setting and outcomes would probably give us a better understanding of a shared, shared goals moving forward.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any comments on that, or anything else to do with the timeline or the content? Okay, well, I think we can work with this to maybe tweak the schedule and send it out to folks, as well as a calendar poll to pin down some dates. We were thinking we would, it looks like we will stay mostly virtual, but maybe there'll be a hybrid or in person at some point. But we were thinking we would extend these meetings potentially to 3 hours at some point, just to incorporate everything we're trying to get through. You know, maybe we'll divide it up into two 75-minute sessions with a break in the middle, so people can get up and take a moment. Other than that, and we did have a hold in your calendar for January 31st. I know a lot of the people engaged here are also involved in the General Assembly session. So we were thinking we would just resume our meeting starting in late February, when the Virginia General Assembly closes for the year. Does anyone have any objections to that? Is anybody really? I understand it's good to keep momentum going, but I do know how busy a lot of the people on the call are. So does that seem reasonable to push our next meeting towards the end of February? Right. We have some strong agreement from Carmen. and John. Okay, well, thank you. So we'll send out a calendar poll to reflect that. Okay, other than that, does anybody have any other thoughts on our process? As I say, just to show you what we're going to do after. So again, it can be some written comments following this meeting, but we'll create a schedule based on today's conversation, and then put out a calendar poll for those future meetings. So that's what we'll be working on. But does anyone else have any comments, things we should we should know as we put that all together? Okay, well, I think with that, we'll close it down. Thanks again to the Cara and Janelle at RMI for a great presentation, and thank you all for taking this time on Friday afternoon. Really appreciate everybody's participation. Thank you.